Hi, this is Brent Forsyth for the Berea Church of Christ in North Orange County, California. And welcome back. This is going to be Bible 101, Bible Authority, How to Approach God, Lesson 1-3. And we're glad you're back with us. Last time we talked about how to approach God, how to use the Bible properly using the story of Noah and the ark, the flood. Today we're going to look at another story and learn another lesson, primarily just how important this is to God, that we approach Him in the right way, that we use His Word, His commands properly. And what we're going to find out is not just that God commanded something, but that God commanded how He wanted it to be done as well. And I think that's such an important lesson. I think one of the biggest mistakes in the religious world is that people just don't know how to use the Bible properly. A lot of people look at it as simply a guide, which basically means they'll follow the things that they want to follow, and if they don't like it, it's not going to be a guide for them. Other people look at the Bible as, something to take seriously, but not literally. We don't take it literally because, it's so controversial. It creates fights with people. So we just talk about our feelings and so forth, about what we feel about what God says instead of what God says. And I that's just the wrong way to use the Word of God. In fact, I saw a church sign one time that said, "We take the Bible seriously, but we don't take it literally." Well, I have no idea how you do that. I have no idea what that means. I don't know how you take the Bible seriously, but you don't take it literally. It just makes no sense to me. So, in Lesson 1-3, we're going to take a look at a story called Nadab and Abihu. Now, the story is actually found in Leviticus chapter 10, but don't go there yet. We want to talk about how the pattern for what these two men were doing. So let me give you a little background. This was early on in the creation of the Israelite nation. God had just given them the law of Moses, and He had set up in that law a priesthood. And Moses' brother, Aaron, was the first high priest, and then his sons served as priests. And he had 4 sons. The oldest 2 were Nadab and Abihu, and that's who our story is about. Nadab and Abihu, as it was the duty of priest every day, were offering incense. And so they would offer incense in the morning, and then the next morning they would offer new incense, replacing the old incense. So, did God just tell them to offer incense and then just left it up to them as to how to do that? No. God commanded them a pattern. God commanded them how to offer incense. And as we look at the Bible, we find that pattern actually in connection with a special day in Israel's history. It was called the Day of Atonement. And this was one day a year where all of Israel gathered. They offered certain sacrifices. They had certain ceremonies. And at the end of the day, they were forgiven of their sins. They made atonement. They were at one-ment with God. So if you look at Leviticus 16, it describes what they were to do on the Day of Atonement. And part of that was to offer incense to the Lord. And so look at Leviticus 16, and we're going to read verse 12 and 13. He shall take a fire pan full of coals of fire upon the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground sweet incense, and bring it inside the veil. He shall put the incense on the fire before the Lord, and the cloud of incense may cover the mercy seat that is on the ark of the testimony, otherwise he will die. So, I don't know how familiar you are with the tabernacle. The tabernacle was a tent-like structure that God commanded Israel to build. The tabernacle was the precursor to what we know as the temple, and it was where God dwelt. God actually had, if you want to put it this way, his room, a bedroom, in the tabernacle called the Holy of Holies, or the Most Holy Place. And there was one piece of furniture in there called the Ark of the Covenant. And on top of that ark were two cherubim, two angels, that faced each other, and their wings came from the back to the front, and they touched. And so you can see, as I have a photograph of what that looks like. And that was called, those two cherubim, those two angels, were called the mercy seat. And that's where God, or God's presence, dwelt. That was his throne in the tabernacle. And they were always separated. God was always separated from Israel through this veil that stood between the holy place and the most holy place. Well, right before that veil, that curtain that separated God from the priest, from the rest of Israel, was an altar. And this altar was basically just kind of almost like a pillar or a table. And what they would do is they put the fire pan on top of it. And the smoke would then go through the veil into the most holy place. And God would smell it, and God would be pleased with that offering. It was a soothing aroma to him. So that is what Nadab and Abihu were doing. So let's go ahead and take a look at the pattern. Remember, we talked about in Noah's Ark that we're looking for the specifics that we can learn from the command or the example. Leviticus 16 is the command. And so let's take a look at what God required of these priests. Number one, you had to be a Levitical priest. Number two, you had to use a perspective fire pan, a fire pan that was made, in essence, for this. God, in fact, instructed how this was to be made as well. Then they were to take fire from the altar of the Lord, sometimes called the brazen altar. You see a picture of it here. This was the big altar outside, in front of the laver, the washing basin, if you will. And this was this big altar where they would offer all the animals. They would burn the animals with fire here as part of the burnt offering, the sacrifice of animals. So the coals of fire were to be taken from this altar, and they were to be placed in the fire pans. And then they were to use 2 handfuls of incense, according to Leviticus 16. And then, of course, the incense and the coals of fire would all combine, and they would, create this smoke, this smell of incense. A lot of people have incense today, or something like potpourri that you can even light up, and it has this soothing aroma to it. Well, once that all happened, they were to then take the fire pan into the tabernacle, into the holy place, and they were to set it up on that altar, and basically their deed was done. So, as we did with the previous story, let's take a look at what we could put under generic authority. Those things that God didn't specifically talk about that become authorized. And in this case, they become authorized because he commanded them to offer incense. Well, there wasn't a whole lot that I could find here. Basically, it could be any priest. As long as you were a priest, you could do this. And Nadab and Abihu were Levitical priests. And so they had all authority to offer this incense. It was part of their job. In fact, the priests took turns offering incense. Also, it could be any fire pan, as long as it was that designated built fire pan for this purpose. In other words, the specific is so direct. There isn't a whole lot that becomes an expedient. There's not a whole lot that needs to be under generic authority. But then let's talk about God's silence. Remember, in God's silence, this is things that we do not practice. Even though God didn't say we can't, we don't practice them because they break the specific pattern in that. So this is where our story with Nadab and Abihu takes place. So let's now go over to Leviticus 10. And I want you to get a Bible if you haven't already and read with us. Just take a visual look at this story. The kind of the interesting thing about Leviticus is it's a hard read. Especially the beginning part of Leviticus. It's all about how to offer these sacrifices, and if it's going to be a sin offering, you got to do this, and you got to offer this animal, and if it's a burnt offering, you got to do this and that, and it's a lot of information. But interestingly, you get to chapter 10, and all of a sudden, you have a story. You have a narrative. And it happens to involve two priests. Okay? Well, let's take a look at this story. And no doubt, I think this is a story that God intended for the priest, as well as all of Israel, to learn from. Because what? These two priests do not approach God in the right way. So in Leviticus chapter 10, verse 1, we read, "Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting fire on them, they placed incense on it, and they offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out from the presence of the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, 'It is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be honored.' So Aaron therefore kept silent." Wow. So here is Nadab and Abihu. And let's go back to our patterns. Okay. Well, look at our pattern. You had to be a Levitical priest. Well, I talked about this. Yes, check. They were priests. They had to use their respective fire pans. Well, verse 1 tells us that's exactly what they did. Check. They did that. Let's drop down a little bit. They had to use incense, 2 handfuls of incense. Well, it seems that according to verse 1, that's what they did. They placed the fire on top of the incense. So everything's fine. At this point, they're following the patterns perfectly. But we get to the fire. And the text tells us, and I'm reading the New American Standard, that they offered up strange fire. Some translations have their profane fire. In essence, I believe what happened was they took fire from some other place, some other source. Where they got that fire, I don't know. Why they took it from some other place, again, I don't know. But they were to take it from the altar of the Lord. And it's obviously they didn't do that. They took fire that was not commanded by God. Now, as you look at that, look at this pattern. Did they put the fire pan on the altar inside the tabernacle? Well, I don't know. Maybe they didn't get that far. I'm not sure. But in essence, that's what they were going to do. And so as you look at this list, they had everything except for one thing. They took fire from a different source. And God consumed them with fire. God took their lives as a lesson. for everyone else, especially the priest. In essence, God said, this is serious, people. I'm not playing around here. God is very serious, not just that we look at what to do, but how to do it. And we'll talk about how that relates to us today. But I want you to notice again verse 3. Aaron was obviously upset. He was in shock. He was confused. And Moses called Nadab and Abihu's actions as unholy, not treating God as holy, and not honoring God. And again, I want you to notice they just changed one thing. They still had fire. It just was from somewhere else. And I could just see people today saying, well, that is a mean God. That's an angry God. I don't want to worship a God like that. Well, you can't just make your own God. It's the God, the real God. It's Yahweh. It's the God of the Bible. And so we've got to understand that God is serious about this. That God wants us to not only follow His command, He wants us to do it the right way, how He has commanded us. And so we put fire from other sources under the column of God's silence. Why? It's not because God didn't tell us or God didn't say, don't do that. He didn't have to. He told us where He wanted the fire to come from. And everything else we should be silent on. And it's kind of interesting. I know it doesn't mean this. But after Moses said what he said, it says that Aaron kept silent. And that's exactly what we need to do. Not add stuff that breaks the specific pattern. Not to just say, well, God didn't say I can't do it, and therefore do it. Now, let me say one more thing before we close this lesson. A lot of people like to say that, well, that's the God of the Old Testament. You're looking at these stories in the Old Testament. God in the New Testament is different. He's a God of love, not a God of wrath. Well, let's go to a story in the New Testament in Acts chapter 5 and put that to the test. Has God become different? I agree that there are some things that change under the New Testament covenant, under the law of Christ, but God has not changed. Yes, maybe some of His wrath is reserved for final judgment, but that doesn't mean He isn't a God of wrath when it comes to sin. He's still a God that cannot dwell with sin. He's still a God that will not leave sin unpunished. He's still a God of love, and that love is couched in terms of how He kept us away from that wrath, how He gave us a way to stay away from the wrath of sin and judgment, destruction. But in Acts chapter 5, hopefully you're familiar with the story. Real quick, this is a time where we're under the new covenant. We're dealing with Christians. Two Christians by the name of Ananias and his wife Sapphira, Acts 5 verse 1. And what's going on is the church is doing benevolence. And if you look back at Acts chapter 4 verse 32, you can read a little bit of that, where some Christians who had surplus were actually selling land and homes and bringing the proceeds, bringing some of that money, sometimes all of it, and laying at the apostles' feet to help other Christians who were in need, who didn't have food, who didn't have perhaps shelter or clothing. And so that's what was going on. Well, Ananias and Sapphira, two Christians, two new Christians, as the church, again, like in our story, Israel was just newly created very early on in the beginning of the law. Well, here we have the same thing. The church has just started. God's spiritual Israel. And we have two Christians. Well, again, the New Testament refers to Christians as priests. And so in a way, we're dealing with two priests, just like we were with Nadab and Abihu. Well, Ananias and Sapphira decide that they want to look like everyone else. They decide they want to tell everybody, hey, this is the full amount that we received when we sold our property. Well, the problem is they lie. It's not the full amount. The problem wasn't that they held back some. In fact, Peter will tell them, it was in your charge, it was in your control. You could do that. You didn't have to give all of this. Was a free will offering. But they decided to take back part, but tell everybody this was all that we got, so that they would look so generous, they would look like everyone else. In reality, they were not. Well, God decided that's not the way He wants people to approach Him. He wants people to be honest. If they don't give it all, that's fine. But tell people that you've given it all. So let's look at Acts chapter 5, verse 1. But a man named Ananias with his wife Sapphira sold a piece of property, and they kept back some of the price for himself with his wife's full knowledge. And bringing a portion of it, he laid it at the apostles' feet. But Peter said, Ananias, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back some of the price of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, was it not under your control? Why is it that you have conceived this deed in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. And as he heard these words, Ananias fell and breathed his last. And great fear came over all who heard of it. The young man got up and covered him up. And after carrying out, they buried him. Verse 7. Now there elapsed an interval about 3 hours, and his wife came in not knowing what had happened. And Peter responded to her, Tell me whether you sold the land for such and such a price. And she said, Yes, that was the price. Then Peter said to her, Why is it that you have agreed together to put the Spirit of the Lord to the test? Behold, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out as well. And immediately she fell at his feet and breathed her last. And the young man came in and found her dead. And they carried her out and buried her beside her husband. And great fear came over the whole church and over all who heard of these things. Well, it almost sounds like the same story. 2 priests, 2 Christians, not approaching God with honor, not with reverence, but with lies. Not carrying out benevolence the way God wanted to. And so what did he do? He used them as a lesson. He brought fear among the church, so that people understand God is serious about this. He took their lives. And this is the New Testament. This is in the church. This is under the law of Christ. So, in this lesson, I hope you see that we can't just take we don't take the Bible literally approach. We can't use it as just kind of a guide. It's got to be the rule of life. Christ has to be the one that you follow, the one that you're trying to become like. And so that brings us to the end of lesson 1-3. Again, we appreciate anytime you want to visit with us. Here is our website. Here's our phone number if you want to leave a message. Our website is on there. Our email. We appreciate comments, questions. We definitely want to answer any questions you have with a biblical answer. So there is a lesson -1, 1-4. So go ahead and if you have time, go to that. If not, we'll come back to it and we'll see you then. Thank you again for studying with us.